Yesterday, I attended an incredible performance of Handel's Messiah in Seattle's Benaroya Hall, along with my daughter and some generous church friends who brought us along. They have season passes. And I heard a rich, resonant bass sing these words straight from Psalm 2, words that were projected in supertitles above the stage. Why do the nations so furiously rage together? Why do the people imagine a vain thing? That's not quite a quotation from the King James, but it's close. The King James reads, "Why do the heathen rage, and the people imagine a vain thing?" That's Psalm 2:1. There are count them, three false friends in this one verse in the King James. 3 words that I predict a significant percentage of modern readers will misunderstand because of language change. They'll misunderstand at least partially. Can you spot them? Pause the video. Make your guesses. One of these 3 false friends is one of the more surprising and significant and frequent false friends that I've ever encountered in the King James. This one was just sent to me by a friend. I had never noticed it in all my years reading through the King James, even though it appears in Psalm 2, a passage I really love, one I think about often, one that my mentor cited regularly, one that I memorized. To find out what it is, what the false friend is in this verse, the main one, you'll have to watch to the end of the video. I'm going to start with the other 2. The first false friend in this verse is actually rage. This is actually a word that still appears in some modern English translations of this verse. I'm not criticizing the King James for including it, or the Geneva Bible, which also used it. That's because in their English, rage was an appropriate translation. But I do think that my beloved ESV, CSB, New King James, and Modern English Version were wrong to hold on to this word. Rage in 1611 could mean something it can't mean today. I've got 3 false friends to cover in this video, 3 false friends in one verse, so I'm going to be efficient with the first 2. The Hebrew word here, translated rage, simply does not mean get very angry. It means to be restless or to be in tumult. Behold and lo, the OED has an obsolete sense of rage that meant almost exactly that. This is obscure and a little difficult, but I really believe I'm seeing what's there. The word rage could mean to behave wantonly, licentiously, or riotously with a person, to romp, frolic, play. The OED names this sense as obsolete. In 1600, for example, Shakespeare spoke of pampered animals who rage in savage sensuality. A writer in 1644 wrote, "We rage in laughter." Neither writer was speaking of anger. They were speaking of people who behave licentiously or riotously, people in a tumult of loud sin, in an uproar. And that's what David is saying in Psalm 2:1. Why are the nations in an uproar? Or why are the nations in turmoil? That's the idea. The old Latin Vulgate has, why did the nations roar? You can roar in anger, but that's not the idea here. It's roaring in a savage, sinful restlessness. Now, I'm not saying rage means behave riotously wherever it occurs in the King James. Most of the 24 times this English verb rage occurs, it does mean to be angry. And we know this in part because it's used to translate Hebrew and Greek words that mean anger. In Jonah 1:15, the King James says that when the sailors threw Jonah into the sea ceased from her raging. The modern translations say the same thing because the Hebrew word there means to be angry. But there are a few passages where rage is a false friend in the King James, and one of them was a memory verse that I have hidden in my heart to this day. Wine is a mocker, strong drink is raging, and whosoever is deceived thereby is not wise. That's Proverbs 20, verse 1. Did you ever wonder what that meant? Strong drink is raging? It doesn't mean that alcohol makes people angry, although that's true apparently for some drinkers. The Hebrew means, and the King James translators meant, that the person who drinks strong drink engages in riotous, tumultuous behavior. The Latin Vulgate uses the word tumultuosa. I'm not proposing a new idea, but a very old one. Rage is a false friend in at least these 2 passages in the King James. Look for yourself. Can you find any more instances of the word rage in the King James in which it's a false friend? I don't think they all are. Second false friend in Psalm 2:1 is the word imagine. Why do the heathen rage and the people imagine a vain thing? I'll be efficient with this one too. The Hebrew word here simply does not mean what we mean by imagine, which is to form a mental image or concept of something. That's the New Oxford American Dictionary. The Hebrew word here actually means plot, and that's just the word that modern versions tend to use. This Hebrew verb is also used in Psalm 38. Can you spot it? Those who intend to kill me set traps and those who want to harm me threaten to destroy me. They plot treachery all day long. It's that word plot. This Hebrew word is also used in Proverbs 24:2. Can you spot it? Their hearts plan violence. Did I make that easy for you? And their words stir up trouble. So the Hebrew word here means plot, not imagine. Was the King James wrong? As usual on this channel, the answer is no. The King James translators were just using a different English. And in their English, imagine could mean plot. Look at the OED. To conceive in the mind as a thing to be performed, to devise, plot, plan. The OED says that this sense is now archaic or rare. I should think so. We have our second false friend in one verse, one important verse. Let me explain the difference here one more time between what contemporary English readers see and what the King James translators actually meant. The teenage nerd may imagine going out with the cheerleader, but he has no plan or intent. His cause is hopeless. He isn't devising any plots to actually ask her out in real life. But the people who imagine a vain thing are actively coming up with a plan to oppose the Lord. This amazing and wonderful psalm mocks them. They are plotting something impossible. They are devising schemes against the Lord himself and against his anointed. God just laughs, like the man who puts his hand on a toddler's head while that toddler furiously tries to punch him. Modern readers of Psalm 2:1 in the King James don't miss all of this, but they miss a little of it. And the fix is easy. Just use the modern equivalent of imagine. Just say plot. Knowledge of this false friend helps us in several other well-known places in the King James, like Genesis 11:6. And the Lord said, "Behold, the people is one, and they have all one language, and this they begin to do, and now nothing will be restrained from them which they have imagined to do." The Hebrew word here, too, means planned or plotted. What other uses of imagine or imagination in the King James do you think are false friends? I looked and I saw a few more. Can you find them? And did you find the other false friend in Psalm 2:1? I'll bet you didn't. I certainly did not until it was shown to me by my best friend just the other day via an email. It's not the word heathen. It's not the word vain. It's not the word thing. This one is going to shock you. It's actually the word people. You're just not going to believe this. At first, I didn't. It just seemed too weird when my friend sent it to me. But I looked into the details, and he was right. Let's do the same together. Simply put, the Hebrew here is plural, peoples, and yet the King James chose to render this word as a singular, people. There's no textual variant in the Hebrew. The ancient Greek Septuagint is plural too, as is the Latin Vulgate. I have a set of 21 Bible translations that I check all the time in Logos. It's a little more complicated than this, but basically only 3 of them took people as singular. That was the King James, the Geneva Bible, and the New King James. So take note, King James defenders, here we have another place where I'm saying that a modern translation not only got it wrong, but got tripped up by a false friend that made them hold on to the King James tradition without realizing that English had shifted underneath their feet, or rather underneath their great-great-great-great-grandparents' feet. Why would the King James and the Geneva Bible and the New King James translate a plural word with a singular? There's a reason, one based in language change. Just look at this. The OED says that there was a time in English when the apparently singular word people could be used with plural agreement. It meant nations, plural. That's just what we have in Psalm 2:1. The word is singular, people, and in part because people is a funny word that can be used as a count noun or a mass noun. In other words, it can be viewed as a whole or as a set of individuals. It doesn't strike our ears as funny to hear the people imagine a vain thing. We hear this as a reference to some undisclosed body of persons, however, when the Hebrew shows and the OED is saying that what the King James translators meant was peoples, in other words, nations, people groups. Why do the heathen rage and the people, the nations, imagine a vain thing? The heathen are in a tumult. The nations are plotting an empty scheme. That's the idea here. Look what else the OED says in more detail. In the plural sense, nations, the singular form was frequently used from the 15th to the 18th centuries, constantly so for the Greek and Hebrew plural in Tyndale and Coverdale and other 16th century Bible versions founded upon them, but not in the Rhemish version. They're talking about the Catholic Douay Rheims version. Nearly always so in Geneva and in 1611, where the revisers of 1881 uniformly substituted peoples. They're saying that the King James nearly always used the apparently singular to us, people, when we would say today, peoples. And this causes some problems. This does matter. In Psalm 2:1, I think it's pretty significant that the nations, rather than the people, are plotting a fruitless scheme. I do think that some readers might think this is referring to the people of Israel. Why do the heathen rage and the people of Israel even imagine a vain thing? And I think that other readers will take it as I always did, as a nondescript, indiscriminate reference, rather than a definite one, to the nations that are talked about in the rest of the psalm. I think this distinction becomes clearer if we look at some of the many other places where the King James translates the plural Hebrew word for peoples with the singular to us, people. The ESV does this just one time, same with the NASB. The King James does it 18 times. It's very easy in Logos to search for all the places in the King James where the apparently singular people is used to translate the plural Hebrew word for peoples. Let's go through some of the items on the list, noting where this almost certainly helps us understand what the King James translators really meant. First, knowing that people could be plural helps the English make sense in this verse. 2 nations are in thy womb, and 2 manner of people shall be separated from thy bowels. We could not say that in our English. It would have to be plural. And in the minds of the King James translators, it was. But it isn't just English conundrums that this helps us solve. It helps us see the nature of Isaac's important parting blessing to Jacob. And God Almighty bless thee, and make thee fruitful, and multiply thee, that thou mayest be a multitude of people. He isn't just saying that many people, a large group, will come from Jacob, but that many separate groups, nations, will. This makes him a direct heir of the promises of God to Abraham, to whom God promised that he'd become a multitude of nations. Jacob repeats this promise that he received with the very same words that he was given. He repeats it to his son Joseph. And I'm saying that in such all-important words, covenant words, words repeated so many times at key turning points in the history of salvation, it matters that we understand what God was attempting to communicate in his word and what the King James translators were attempting to communicate. And they were using a word that for them meant peoples or nations. Here's another example in a key statement of Jacob to Judah. The scepter shall not depart from Judah, nor a lawgiver from between his feet, until Shiloh come, and unto him shall the gathering of the people be. I perhaps should have used this verse as my central example in the video, because here, I think, is a place where language change is actually causing a misunderstanding, I would think, for most readers. If God were really moving Jacob to say that the people were gathering to Judah, then that would seem to refer to the people we would later call the people of Israel. But if what God and the King James translators meant was peoples or nations, then this is a promise that some descendant of Judah would be the gathering point for the nations. And isn't that true? That's the Messiah. There's another problem this knowledge of a false friend solves. In Exodus 15, Moses sings a song of victory after the Red Sea crossing. He sings to the Lord, "Thou in thy mercy hast led forth the people which thou hast redeemed." People here in Hebrew is singular. Moses goes on, "Thou hast guided them in thy strength unto thy holy habitation. The people shall hear and be afraid. Sorrow shall take hold on the inhabitants of Palestina." In our English, this sounds like the Israelites will hear and be afraid. So the next line is awkward. The Israelites will be afraid, and sorrow will affect those in Palestine. But if you know that people could, depending on context, mean peoples or nations, then this makes perfect sense. The Lord led forth the Israelite people, singular. The surrounding peoples, plural, will hear about it and be afraid. And a few chapters later, in a famous and important passage in Exodus, in which God describes the role of the people of Israel, Exodus 19, the King James has this, "Now therefore, if ye will obey my voice indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, for all the earth is mine." Similarly, "For thou art an holy people unto the Lord thy God. The Lord thy God hath chosen thee to be a special people unto himself above all people that are upon the face of the earth." The pattern should be familiar by now. The Israelites are God's special personal possession. Remember from a previous video, peculiar is a false friend. They are a treasure above all peoples, above all other nations, in other words. They are a holy people, singular, above all people, plural, above all other peoples. There are many other passages where the King James translates a Hebrew plural with the apparently singular English word people. And I don't think these will all cause severe misunderstandings, but they won't cause good understanding either. There'll be little unseen bumps in the sidewalk over which people just don't realize they are tripping. All the gods of the people are idols, but the Lord made the heavens. David says this in his Song of Thanks in 1 Chronicles 16. This sounds like an indictment of David's fellow Jews. What gods are the people worshiping? But no, David is saying that the gods of the nations are idols. Now, I'm not sure the average reader in 1611 got all this. Based on what I have read in the OED, however, this was a common practice, and by definition, that means some people, plural, but I'm speaking of individuals, they did get it. Did you get it? Can you find other instances in which this false friend occurs in the King James? You'll have to check the Hebrew too to find out if it's plural. I'd love to hear in the comments. Now, there is actually some pretty severe complexity in all this, both in Hebrew and in English. There are points of ambiguity in both languages when it comes to the words we're discussing, and I feel I need to mention two of them, lest the skeptical and skillful score some easy points off me. The Hebrew does use a plural form of people, even in some places where surely only one people, the Jews, is meant. Various sins are said to cause someone in Israel to be cut off from his people, and that is plural in the Hebrew. Same goes for the common phrase, gathered to his people. Why that's plural in the Hebrew, I just don't know. I saw a commentator or two guessing that it refers to the Jews as a collection of individuals, but again, I don't know. And there are also some ambiguous passages in which it's not perfectly certain whether the King James translators meant to speak of the people, in other words, the Jewish race, or whether they meant to speak of the nations. Zechariah 11:10 speaks in the King James of my covenant which I had made with all the people. The ESV has the covenant that I had made with all the peoples. But in this context, the covenant being spoken of makes better sense as a covenant with the people, singular, of Israel, not as a covenant with the nations. It's just that the Hebrew sure seems to say the latter. Which one did the King James translators mean? I'm not certain. What I do know is that this is one of the more consequential false friends in my whole list of now 83 false friends. It shows up in a lot of key passages because the people of Israel are a major theme in the Bible, of course, but so are the peoples, the nations, whom God was determined to bless through the seed of Abraham, and to whom Jesus sent his disciples, Gentiles like I myself. We are very grateful for this. And here's what else I know. This false friend is one of three that occur in a single consequential verse, Psalm 2:1. It's not as if King James readers are missing everything, but they're not missing nothing. They're missing two little somethings and possibly a somewhat bigger something. And the fix is easy. Use contemporary English. I want to end with a violent segue. You know those violent segues a couple years ago where the AI went haywire and they started rolling all over people in a bid to take over a mall in Akron, Ohio? Yeah, one of those. I'm going to talk about COVID. Remember that pandemic/hoax? Remember how it divided the political world, divided churches? Those divisions are with us to this day. Of course you remember. I spent a lot of time thinking about epistemology during COVID. How do we know what we know? How do we justify our knowledge? I am not an epidemiologist. I lack the skills to do tests myself on the effectiveness or lack thereof of masks against airborne diseases. I guess I trust that COVID was an airborne disease, but I've never even seen a germ through a microscope, let alone floating around in the air. If I were left to my own skills and tools, I would have very little idea what to do. I had to trust somebody. We all did. And that's where a lot of the division came in. Whom do we trust? Here's one thing I concluded. Can't we all agree, at least, that in an ideal world, we could just trust people to do their jobs and trust our society's institutions to fulfill their intended purposes? Like we have this institution called the Centers for Disease Control, the CDC. Who in the world prefers a situation in which the CDC gives guidelines that people can't, or at least don't, trust? Do we really want no CDC? Do we really think it's best for everyone to decide on their own what to do about smallpox or polio? Or do we want a Republican CDC that tells Republicans what they want to hear and a Democrat CDC that has alternative facts? I mean, wouldn't it be nice? Wouldn't it be ideal to have some truths that are nonpartisan? Wouldn't you like to be able to trust people to do hard jobs you don't have time to do, like working out the proper math for making bridges safe, or writing software code that protects your bank account, or producing flame-retardant pajamas for kids, or recalling meat contaminated by E. coli, or preparing for global pandemics, or translating the Bible? If you feel you must radically distrust all of the hundreds of fellow evangelical Christians who are alive today who have tried to translate the Bible for you into your English, contemporary English, can you at least lament that this must be the case rather than exult in it? Wouldn't it be ideal if we could just trust the Christians who give years of their lives to studying Hebrew and Greek. None of my videos, not one, has ever told you not to trust the King James translators. I believe they were trustworthy, most definitely. But I believe that today's translators were trustworthy too. And I think you've got to trust some contemporary English Bible translators, or you're going to miss things. False friends are fun, but they get super complex. Some obscure words in the King James that appear only once or twice are false friends. And so are some rather common and theologically significant words like people. That's complex. Some of these false friends are false friends every time they occur. Many are not, like people. That's complex. You can't just say people means peoples, because frequently it doesn't. I am truly happy to equip exclusive King James readers to read their King James versions with greater understanding. But my agenda is clear, and I'm not hiding it. I think the complexities of King James usage are too great to justify using the King James in institutional contexts like pulpits, publishing houses, and gospel tracts. Taken together, these false friends present an unnecessary impediment to the kind of understanding that would otherwise be possible for people. I think that exclusive King James readers should learn to trust some contemporary translators of the Bible. Consider what a world would be like in which you could just trust the New King James as much as you trust the King James. Can you picture it? Don't rage, people. Just imagine.